Forget New Year, New You. This season is about slowing down, locking the doors, and cozying up at home with the one you really want to do nothing with. Your dog. After the holiday chaos, those quiet nights with a blanket, a podcast, and your pup feel like the reset you actually need. Ollie helps make those moments easier with fresh protein-packed meals made from real human-grade ingredients, so your dog can enjoy some quality comfort food too. Choose from 5 recipes and get a personalized plan for your dog's needs. Meals arrive perfectly proportioned with a scoop and storage container, so serving is fast and mess-free. And with Ollie's in-app on-demand health screenings, supporting your dog is easy, ensuring more cuddles for many years to come. Visit ollie.com/truecrime and use code TRUECRIME for 60% off your first box.
Hey everyone, this week's episode features a guest narrator, my colleague Matt Stroud. Matt is bringing us an important case out of Potsdam, New York. I'll be back next week.
In the college town of Potsdam, New York, far upstate, less than 20 miles from the Canadian border, Oral Nick Hillary was an Army veteran who enrolled at St. Lawrence University in 1996. He excelled in math, and he was a star on the men's soccer team, a captain who led the undefeated St. Lawrence Saints to win the 1999 National Soccer Championship. Nick was a Regional Defensive Player of the Year, All-American, a decorated veteran, and a Potsdam sports hero. By 2011, he was head men's coach at Clarkson University in Potsdam. He advised students in the university's athletic department. He volunteered and mentored students in Potsdam. He had kids who went to local public schools too, so he attended their activities and sporting events. According to friends, he was the kind of guy who spoke the same way to the president of the university as he would to a janitor. Nick is also black, a Jamaican immigrant who emigrated to the United States at 16 with his family. In Potsdam, where the black population is less than 6%, even when it swells by thousands during the school year, that's a rarity. Nick was, by any measure, a pillar of the Potsdam community. He was also a very recognizable person locally. So when police identified Nick in 2011 as a possible suspect in the murder of a 12-year-old boy named Garrett Phillips, it caused a whirlwind in Potsdam of gossip, suspicion, fear, and accusations of racism and unfairness. Someone had entered the Phillips family's apartment and strangled Garrett to death, and local cops honed their investigation on Nick. The case received a ton of attention and spurred a decade-long civil court process. This is the story of how Nick Hillary went from pillar to pariah in his adopted home, and how the tragic killing of a young boy became fodder for a nationwide uproar. I'm Matt Stroud, in this week for Jillian Jalali, and this is a special edition of Court Junkie.
Your style is constantly evolving. It's time for your glasses to start keeping up. Pair Eyewear makes switching out your frames easier than ever. You just snap on a new design to transform your look whenever the mood strikes. Here's how it works. You choose your base frame, which starts at just $60, and this includes prescription lenses. You can use their virtual try-on and choose from all sorts of options, from the square to the cat eye, from classic black to remixed blue tortoise. Then you choose your top frames, which snap on top of the base frame, so you can constantly change up your look. And they have hundreds of top frame designs to choose from. I love my glasses I got from Pair. I got the Larkin base frame, which is the tortoise color. And then for the top frames, I initially got the burgundy, which are these bright red frames that I am just in love with. And then I got 2 sunglasses options that I can snap on, the black sun top and the gold reflective. And then I couldn't help myself, and I got 2 more top frames, a blush color and a tortoise sunglass shade. I wear my glasses a lot more than I used to, and it's so nice to give my eyes a break from my contacts. And not only do they have great glasses, but Pair Eyewear is a great company too. They design all their looks in-house, so you get high-quality eyewear at a fraction of the price. And for every pair purchased, Pair provides glasses to a child in need. Get glasses as ever-changing as you are with Pair. Go to paireyewear.com/court for 15% off your first purchase. That's 15% off at paireyewear.com/court. If you are anything like me, you likely love a good whodunit. And if you like to play games on your phone, then you will love June's Journey. In the game, you're June Parker, an amateur detective on a quest to solve the murder of her sister and uncover her family's many secrets. Along the way, you look for hidden objects before the timer runs out and play a variety of game modes and puzzles. There are new chapters every week, so there's always a new case waiting to be cracked. And there are a bunch of unique things about this game that make it so much fun to play and keep you entertained. For example, you can chat and play with or against other players by joining a detective club. Or you can use the memoir feature, where you can piece together June's past to unlock exclusive awards, like Island Beautifications. Personally, I love to play towards the end of the night after my daughter goes to bed and use it as a great way to unwind from the day. Find your inner detective. Download June's Journey today. Available on Android and iOS mobile devices, as well as on PC through Facebook Games.
Natasha Haverty is a nationally recognized freelance journalist. She spent years reporting for New Hampshire Public Radio, which covered Potsdam, New York. She knows Nick Hillary. She has produced dozens of stories for multiple outlets, including the New York Times, about all the twists and turns of this case. And she knows Potsdam well, too. She says understanding the region itself is helpful to grasp everything that's occurred following the death of Garrett Phillips.
Potsdam is this community that is situated really just south of the Canadian border, above the Adirondack Mountains, along the St. Lawrence River Valley. And it's a place you'd have to drive, at least an hour to, let's say, buy clothes at a chain store, or be in any kind of urban. The closest city is Ottawa, Canada. And its racial makeup is very white. And it's a place that you don't see a lot of people moving to that area, except for the 4 universities in that area.
There's one more thing to note, in particular, about Potsdam.
A lot of its identity comes from being a place that, one of the biggest sources of employment is the New York State Department of Corrections. There's prisons all around. A lot of folks who, let's say, do come from families where they go on to be corrections officers. Their dad was a corrections officer, their uncles are corrections officers. The only person of color a lot of these people have met are people who are behind bars.
It's against this backdrop that an unthinkable tragedy occurred.
Garrett Phillips was a kid whose family is from the North Country, from the Parishville area. Everyone describes him as a really energetic, bright. He had a brother. His father died, I think, from epilepsy. His mom, Tandy, again, grew up in the North Country.
So Garrett was young, 12 years old. He had friends in the community. People knew him around town. October 24th, 2011 began like any other day.
That afternoon, Garrett leaves school after hanging out with some friends, skateboards home, and his mom and brother aren't home at that point. And some neighbors hear some sounds. One neighbor even hears the word help. There's a loud thud, and a neighbor calls 911. By the time that the police officers come on the scene, Garrett is found unconscious, but not dead. And there's bruises, kind of rug burns on his knees, and a sign of some kind of asphyxiation.
By the time emergency responders arrived at Canton Potsdam Hospital with Garrett, the situation was dire. Tandy Phillips, Garrett's mom, was there, stricken with grief. Garrett was pronounced dead at 7:18 p.m. Authorities eventually determined he died from strangulation and suffocation.
Originally, the first theories that the police seemed to be forming in those first hours were some kind of roughhousing like with Garrett and maybe some other kids. But the police seem to move on from that theory pretty quickly.
It can't be stressed enough. Potsdam is small. And St. Lawrence, the county surrounding Potsdam, is not a place where violent crimes regularly occur, let alone homicide. Between 2015 and 2019, an average of 1 murder per year occurred there. Compare that to any major city in the United States, where multiple, sometimes dozens of murders can happen every single day. Killings like this, especially where a 12-year-old kid is the victim, just do not happen in Potsdam. So law enforcement agencies in the region swarm to help.
It's a small police department. And so immediately, New York State police come on the scene. And there's tens of, almost, I think, 100 people come onto this investigation, largely from the New York State police. But Potsdam, and this is important to point out, Potsdam police remains the kind of overseer of the investigation.
There are some names to keep in mind here. When investigators discovered Garrett on October 24th, 2011, Mark Murray was the lieutenant chief of the Potsdam police, second in command, up and coming in the department, and he had recently attended a course about solving homicides, so he stepped in to lead the investigation. Ed Tischler was Murray's boss, then the chief of police. Gary Snell was a member of the New York State Police. John Jones was a deputy with the St. Lawrence County Sheriff's Department. And Brian Phillips, Tandy's brother and Garrett's uncle, also stepped in with information. Brian Phillips was not in law enforcement, but remember what Natasha told us about surrounding communities. Potsdam is a law enforcement town, so Brian particularly, along with the rest of the community, was adamant that someone needed to be held responsible for Garrett's death. Here's Natasha again.
A thing to point out about all these guys is that they all know each other. So Gary Snell, he doesn't come from downstate or he's living in the community. So he, Mark Murray, John Jones, and Brian Phillips all are guys who know each other, maybe played hockey together or whose kids play hockey together or, have seen each other around the community. So they're all very familiar with each other at this point that the investigation begins.
They all knew Nick Hillary, but Nick was not a part of the same clique. Recall that at the time, Nick was head men's coach at Clarkson University in town, and he had roots in the community as well. If you go to the St. Lawrence University student bar, there's a big picture of Nick during St. Lawrence's national championship win in 1999. In the days after Garrett's death, detectives investigating the case called Nick in for questioning at the Potsdam police station. The detectives, Gary Snell representing the New York State Police and Mark Murray representing Potsdam, told Nick that the questioning would be simple, cursory. They wanted to chat with Nick concerning the whereabouts of certain students that Nick might have known on the day of Garrett's death. But there was more to the officers' curiosities than those students. See, Nick had a connection to Garrett. Nick had 5 kids with his ex-wife, but Nick and his ex had separated, and for a while, Nick dated Garrett's mother, Tandy Phillips. Nick and Tandy even lived together, along with Garrett, for a period of time. Nick had moved out of Tandy's apartment by the time of Garrett's death, but suspicion arose in the community and among detectives. When Snell, Murray, and other investigators questioned people aware of the relationship between Nick and Tandy, some talked about Nick being stern with Garrett. They suggested that Garrett didn't like Nick, and that Nick and Garrett had a strained relationship. So yes, officers wanted to ask Nick about a list of students, but that list was a Trojan horse. Really, they wanted to know if Nick killed Garrett Phillips. So Nick agrees. He goes down to the station. The following clip is difficult to parse. It's a recording of a grainy surveillance video showing Nick entering the station, greeting his interviewers.
Why don't you just provide some of his information, his Wayfare and all that? Well, I mean, if you got a reason there, right? We don't have to. We don't have to. If you want to hear me there, it's not really doesn't bother you much. You're not under arrest. Let's get to the case. Yes, thank you. How long have you gone out with Andy? I've been seeing Andy since September.
At the outset of the interview, the detectives didn't have a warrant for Nick Hillary. In a video from the interview, you can see Gary Snell and Mark Murray easing into the conversation. just talking with Nick. They're figuring out their strategy as they go. And they're asking him about Tandy Phillips, what Nick thought of her, how their relationship progressed and perhaps devolved.
She's a good-looking girl, obviously, and draws attention. You know what I mean? Is there other people that express a big interest in her, or that you're aware of any? I'm aware of some. I know several people have always liked her. You know, that's the thing that I can't really say.
But soon, things got real. There was a moment after they'd gone through a few student names when Nick told them that he had to go to work, that he wanted to be helpful, but he had other commitments for the day. Gary Snell coyly started to read Nick his Miranda rights.
And you watch this realization cross Nick Hillary's face of what's really going on here. And Nick Hillary immediately dials up his lawyer, which does not make Mark Murray or Gary Snell happy. And then he says, look, I'm going. You don't have the right to hold me here. And Mark Murray gets really exasperated and says, fine, just go.
But Nick wasn't going anywhere.
Hillary gets up to leave. Gary Snell blocks Nick Hillary from exiting. And Mark Murray kind of creeps up behind him.
Natasha stresses that the visual here and the dynamics of the situation were striking. Yes, Nick was a soccer star, a coach, a pillar of the community.
Nick Hillary is also a Black man in a largely white community. He's Jamaican born. He served in the army for a while, but very notably, he's a Black man living in a very white community. So when I'm talking about this day where Nick Hillary is detained and this video that I've watched countless times now of Mark Murray and Gary Snell blocking Nick Hillary from exiting this office at the police station, it's striking visually to just see this Black man being surrounded by these white officers. And it just has a resonance universally at this point. So they don't let him leave.
Nick did have a lawyer locally who arrived eventually at the station, but there was really nothing Nick could do as all this transpired. He had to play along.
The officers, to some extent, the police had a plan to try to get Nick Hillary to say something that would implicate him, but they weren't quite sure how they were going to do it. So when you're watching it, they're offering Nick Hillary water because they're hoping to get some DNA from his lips touching the rim of the bottle. He refuses the water at first. Then Nick Hillary was a smoker, so they're hoping to get DNA evidence from the cigarette butt. Nick Hillary, for whatever reason, doesn't throw away the cigarette. He keeps the cigarette butt. So there's this strange choreography or improvisation, depending on what angle you're coming from when you watch that video.
This choreography went on for hours. What the detectives really wanted at this time was to photograph Nick's body. They had a theory that whoever murdered Garrett exited the apartment through the back window and jumped down a brick shed before getting down to the ground, which is a descent that might cause an injury. And so they thought that whoever killed Garrett would have some kind of scratch or cut to their ankle or their knee.
That would point at them being the person who did this. So from the very beginning, as things start to devolve, you hear Mark Murray saying things like, well, just lift up your leg. Just lift up your pant leg. Just show me your leg. That's all I'm asking for. Just show me your leg. And Nick Hillary saying, no, I'm not going to do that.
Around this time, Mark Murray applied for a search warrant. So they kept Nick detained. And when they finally got that warrant, they stripped Nick down naked and photographed him.
And that's important to point out, is he's detained without a warrant for many hours, but that strip search happens after the warrant comes.
When Nick finally walked out of the station that day, some 8 hours after arriving, he wore plastic sheeting. Snell and Murray kept Nick's clothing, cell phone, and his keys as possible evidence. Nick wasn't the only person to be questioned about Garrett's death. In fact, detectives questioned another one of Tandy Phillips's exes, John Jones. He's the St. Lawrence Sheriff's deputy who knew Snell, Murray, and Garrett's uncle, Brian. But Jones's questioning didn't involve a strip search, and Nick was the only one to be stripped nude.
Court Junkie is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Most of you listening right now are probably multitasking. While you're listening to me talk, you're probably also driving, cleaning, exercising, maybe even grocery shopping. But if you're not in some kind of moving vehicle, there's something else you could be doing right now. Getting an auto quote from Progressive Insurance. It's easy, and you could save money by doing it right from your phone. Drivers who save by switching to Progressive save over $700 on average. And auto customers qualify for an average of 7 discounts. Discounts for having multiple vehicles on your policy, for being a homeowner, and more. So just like your favorite podcast, Progressive will be with you 24/7, 365 days a year. So you're protected no matter what. Multitask right now. Quote your car insurance at Progressive.com to join the over 27 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates national annual average insurance savings by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2020 and May 2021. Potential savings will vary. Discounts not available in all states and situations.
He gave me a book on art forgery. I found myself drawn to these old masters. How did these artists take paint from a palette, arrange it on a canvas? I began to unlock the secrets. I was a storehouse of knowledge of how to create an illusion, present it to an experienced expert, manipulate his mind, and convince him and bring him to the inevitable conclusion that the painting is genuine. We flooded the market with my paintings, and I couldn't believe what I did. I couldn't believe it. Then the dominoes started falling, and eventually the FBI were led to my door. They uncovered a mountain of evidence against me.
But they never actually got you. At this point, you've sold a lot. You've got like $1 million in cash. You sold one painting for $717,000. Why did it go away? Why did you never get indicted? And how are we having this conversation?
I guess that's the greatest story of all.
To hear how Ken Perenni made millions in art forgery, dodged the mafia and the FBI, subscribe to the Jordan Harbinger Show and check out episode 282 in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening now.
Despite Nick Hillary being strip-searched and subjected to hours of questioning, detectives couldn't amass enough evidence to file charges against him. In fact, they filed no charges at all in Garrett's death. The murder of Garrett Phillips became a cold case. But Nick was not about to merely accept what happened to him. Federal civil cases, filed when someone feels they've been unfairly treated and hope to get compensated in some way for that victimization through the federal court system, gives plaintiffs a 2-year window to file civil charges. And there's a federal statute seemingly designed for the kind of civil case Nick hoped to file. In 1871, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1871. Written to protect Black people from violence perpetuated by the Ku Klux Klan during post-Civil War Reconstruction, the act gave these African Americans the right to seek relief in federal court. Nick and his lawyers saw a parallel between post-Civil War violence and the way law enforcement officers treated him as they investigated Garrett's killing. So, about a year after the strip search, on November 9th, 2012, Nick and his attorneys filed a civil rights lawsuit. The lawsuit alleged false arrest, false imprisonment, violation of civil rights, assault and battery, and a host of other assertions. The village of Potsdam, Ed Tischler, its chief, and Mark Murray, its lead investigator, were the main defendants. But the lawsuit targeted as many as 100 John Doe officers who Nick claimed participated in violating his rights. Local media reported the lawsuit, but it seemed like a questionable move within the community. This is Natasha Haverty, the New Hampshire Public Radio reporter again.
I think it makes the case a lot more complicated because someone might say, geez, if this guy is trying to hide this horrible crime he committed, why would he initiate this case that is going to involve him doing a deposition and all these other members of law enforcement doing a deposition? I mean, why would you make this so public if you're trying to keep something a secret? Someone might argue.
Garrett's killing remained unsolved. Natasha actually didn't begin her staff reporting work in Potsdam until about the time when Nick filed his civil rights lawsuit. And as someone assigned to report on the entire community, many others surrounding it, There were other things for Natasha to cover. But soon, Garrett's story caught her attention. It was difficult to miss.
I became aware of Garrett's death the way many people in the community would, which are these lawn signs and billboards that really cover St. Lawrence County that say "Justice for Garrett" and have a picture of Garrett's face. It's his school portrait.
The lawn signs were everywhere, and they weren't idle. The group behind the signs, who discussed various theories and bits of information on a public Facebook group with hundreds of members, offered a $40,000 reward for any actionable information about Garrett's killer. The signs were prominent enough and attracted enough attention that a local public defender, Mary Rain, ran for the St. Lawrence County District Attorney's Office on a platform of bringing charges in Garrett's case. Interest was strong enough locally that Rain got elected.
This new district attorney had been elected, and when she was campaigning, she would often be at her campaign stops and the steps of the St. Lawrence County Courthouse next to Garrett's mom, who kind of helped her with her campaign because Mary Rain's campaign was really kind of fueled by this promise that she was going to achieve justice for Garrett, that the last district attorney had just not done it and had failed the community, but that Mary Rain was going to deliver justice.
After her election in 2014, Mary Rain did, in fact, convene a grand jury to hear evidence in Garrett's case. The grand jury recommended charges be filed. The defendant, Nick Hillary. To anyone paying attention at the time, the charges might not have been a surprise. It struck Natasha and her colleagues at New Hampshire Public Radio as unusual, though.
I went to Nick Hillary's arraignment hearing. It was coming to the courthouse and watching this pretty basic arraignment hearing, and watching the way this public official spoke about her investigation. Something just felt off to me and my colleagues. And I think when we got back to the newsroom, I remember sitting down with my colleagues, and the way that my colleagues who have lived in the North Country a lot longer than I had, so had really lived through the tragedy, Garrett's death, the way they closed the door of the newsroom and still kept the conversation in a whisper. It was this moment of wow, this is deep. This is really deep in the bones of this community, a fear of even really looking at it and asking, what is going on?
It turned out that Mary Rain pulled a lot of her circumstantial evidence against Nick from his own depositions in his civil rights case. In the prosecutor's eyes, he showed a lack of candor. He offered
a lot of, I don't recall, because a lot of the questions that happen in the deposition are, okay, you turned left on Leroy Street and right on Main Street. Is that right? And a big argument that Nick Hillary's side made is, look, do you remember, whether you took left or right out of the grocery store parking lot 3 years ago? So, but to be fair, it's a lot of hours of Nick Hillary saying he doesn't remember things. And editing is really powerful. And what the prosecution did was kind of condense a lot of those I don't recall to sort of paint Nick Hillary as this insensitive, sort of conveniently forgetful person on this really pivotal day in the community and the Phillips family's life.
Nick was arrested on May 15th, 2014. He maintained his innocence as he was being arrested. A local news outlet, the Watertown Daily Times, captured his arrest.
100% innocent. 100% innocent. That's all I have to say.
Nick would spend months in jail after his arrest. He was eventually released. The case took another 2 years to actually come to trial, and Nick made a surprising decision. After going through the arduous process of selecting a jury with his lawyers, Nick felt that the Potsdam community had been so convinced of his guilt through yard signs, as well as Mary Rain's running and winning a district attorney's election based on prosecuting him, that he decided to forego a jury trial. Instead, he and his lawyers decided on a bench trial, a trial in which a judge alone would hear arguments and ultimately decide his guilt or innocence. Judge Felix Catania, overseeing the case, dismissed the jury. And on September 12, 2016, Nick Hillary went to trial for the murder of Garrett Phillips. In addition to pulling from Nick's civil depositions, prosecutors, a team consisting of Mary Rain representing St. Lawrence County and William Fitzpatrick, the district attorney of Onondaga County, New York, who assisted Rain, claimed that Nick concocted an elaborate plan to stalk Garrett. Here's Fitzpatrick from the prosecution.
He was hunting Garrett, the little boy who had the audacity to dislike the great Nick Hillary. The many names that have been labeled on this defendant are the innocent man, the wrongfully accused. I want you to label him for exactly what he is, the murderer of a helpless 12-year-old boy.
Prosecutors argued that Nick's relationship with Tandy Phillips, Garrett's mom, came to an end because Garrett didn't like Nick, and that Nick then sought to exact revenge on the boy for bringing that relationship to a close. Prosecutors would outline that Nick was seen near the Phillips apartment in the minutes when Garrett was killed. Members of Nick's team painted those accusations as preposterous. Here's one of Nick's attorneys, Norm Siegel.
No one will come into this courtroom and say, I saw Nick Hillary sneak into the home of this child before he was killed. And why? Because it didn't happen. And no one, absolutely no one, will come into this courtroom and say to you, Your Honor, I saw Nick Hillary run out of Garrett Phillips' home after he was killed. Why? Because it didn't happen.
We're skipping through a lot of what transpired at the criminal trial because Nick's civil and criminal cases are very complicated, and there's a lot to go through in a single episode. But we'll cut to one significant point that emerged in the criminal trial that nearly upended more than just the lives of those directly affected by Garrett's death. As Nick's criminal trial progressed toward its conclusion, Nick's attorney discovered that more than a year earlier, detectives investigating Garrett's case interviewed a man named Gregory Brown and didn't disclose it. Brown told detectives that he was near the Phillips apartment around the time of Garrett's killing, and that he saw a man enter their Potsdam apartment building. That man was St. Lawrence County Sheriff's Deputy John Jones. Just a reminder, John Jones was the sheriff's deputy who hung around with Brian Phillips, Garrett's uncle, as well as Mark Murray and Ed Tischler, the Potsdam police who spearheaded the murder investigation. Jones also dated Tammy Phillips, Garrett's mom. Under federal rules and procedures, prosecutors are required to disclose any information that might be seen as exculpatory and relevant to the guilt or innocence of a defendant. The rule stems from a 1963 U.S. Supreme Court case, Brady v. Maryland. Failing to disclose exculpatory evidence is known as a Brady violation. Nick's attorneys believed a Brady violation happened here. They called for a mistrial. Judge Catania denied it, but the information clearly influenced the direction of the trial. On September 28, 2016, 14 days after trial began, and just shy of 5 years after Garrett Phillips' murder, Judge Catania convened all parties to hear his ruling. He began by acknowledging that the prosecution's case against Nick Hillary was flimsy.
The case against the defendant is entirely based upon circumstantial evidence. Because of this, the court must review the evidence in this case under a rigorous standard. That is, while a person's guilt of a charged crime may be proven by circumstantial evidence, if that evidence, while not directly establishing guilt, gives rise to an inference of guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, it must appear that the inference of guilt is the only one that can fairly and reasonably be drawn from the facts, and that the evidence excludes beyond a reasonable doubt every reasonable hypothesis of innocence. This court has fully and fairly considered the evidence in this case pursuant to that standard, along with the other applicable and stipulated to criminal instructions.
Finally, Judge Catania issued his verdict.
Accordingly, it is the judgment of this court that as to the charge of murder in the second degree, as charged in the indictment, the defendant, Oral Nicholas Hillary, is found not guilty.
Not guilty. For Nick, his family, and his legal team, the acquittal was a vindication. a hard line demonstrating that Nick's claims all along were true, that he was not a stalker, that he was not a killer. For the Phillips family and their supporters, however, the verdict was devastating. Here's Natasha Haverty again.
The whole trial was also like the family reliving what they'd gone through. And you felt that every day, that as they went sort of blow by blow through the crime, through the death, through the investigation. If you looked over to the Phillips side of the courthouse, it was awful. It was painful. And so when the verdict was handed down, there were a lot of tears and kind of heads bowing. And I think it was both, we really believe that this guy did it, that we really believe that Nick Hillary is guilty, but also, oh my gosh, no resolution.
But that was not the end of the story. Not by a long shot. A New York state court found Nick Hillary not guilty in the killing of Garrett Phillips. That left many in the Potsdam community starving for answers. Reporter Natasha Haverty offered some insights about how the verdict felt to community members.
There was no sign that there were any other suspects or any other roads to getting justice or resolution. So I think on the one hand, it's opened up conversations and, gotten rid of some of that back porch finger pointing, but I think the community is just completely at sea. Like, what happens now?
Adding to the lack of resolution, St. Lawrence County District Attorney Mary Rain took an unusual step.
Because that day that the verdict was handed down, Mary Rain held a press conference, which I didn't get to go to because I and another journalist were on the list of people that wouldn't be allowed in, which I've never heard of, but she was but where she said, I still maintain, I am 100% sure that Nick Hillary is guilty.
That is, to put it mildly, out of the ordinary in this kind of high profile case.
So I haven't covered a lot of murder cases, but I haven't heard about behavior like that much. And I think that's just sending a message to the community, like, we don't have anything else. Sorry, folks. And I think that's just really destabilizing.
Mary Rain didn't just attract attention for stating her sincere belief that the system had failed Garrett Phillips. One specific aspect of Nick's trial that remained unresolved was the matter of the prosecution's clear Brady violation. A judge declined to declare a mistrial when it emerged that prosecutors failed to disclose that John Jones, a former boyfriend of Garrett's mom, had been implicated as a possible suspect in Garrett's killing by an eyewitness. But there was a clear rule violation there, a pretty severe one. Mary Rain's term as St. Lawrence County District Attorney ended in 2017. But in 2018, a New York state court suspended Rain's law license, finding that Rain exhibited a pattern of disregard for defendants' rights. Chief among their reasoning was her handling of Nick Hillary's case. That was a small victory for Nick Hillary and his attorneys, but there was still the matter of Nick's civil case. Recall that Nick filed a civil rights lawsuit against the village of Potsdam and more than 100 law enforcement officers who sought to place blame for Garrett's killing squarely on him. 3 primary cops, Gary Snell of the New York State Police and both Mark Murray and Ed Tischler of the Potsdam Police, strip-searched Nick during an all-day ordeal back in 2011. Nick's civil claims were on hold while he went to trial for Garrett's killing. Now that the criminal trial was over, Nick sought to be compensated for having his civil rights violated. Civil cases, generally speaking, tend to take forever to transpire. Motions are filed, facts are considered, claims for discovery information, documents and recordings, for example, need to be considered and argued. Defendants can be added or dismissed, and that can take years or longer in arguably typical cases. And it's not every day that a murder trial postpones civil proceedings. Here's Natasha Haverty.
Most defendants on the civil rights case over the years are dismissed. At a certain point, the civil rights case just seemed to encompass everyone, not just members of the investigation, but like you said, members of the prosecution. And by the time it actually saw daylight, the scope of the civil rights complaint was very narrow.
Nick's criminal trial ended in 2016. It wasn't until this year, 2022, that his civil case actually moved toward trial.
The complaint had been whittled and whittled down from this huge sweeping package of defendants and claims to one very specific claim with a very small group of defendants around the question of whether Potsdam police, really Mark Murray and his then boss, Ed Tischler, had violated Nick Hillary's Fourth Amendment rights.
Nick's Fourth Amendment claims emerged, of course, from the day when he went to the Potsdam police station to be questioned.
When they detained him all day without a warrant, those 2 days after Garrett's death. But the question of unreasonable detention, which is what the Fourth Amendment is about, is really hard to prove because, there's no one clear standard for what unreasonable means, especially when you're talking about these investigators charged with figuring out the murder of a child. You can give them a lot of slack.
During Nick's civil trial, for example, his lawyers brought up that he was Black in a largely white community and that his race may have played a role in investigators targeting him. The judge presiding over the case reminded the jury that police could have brought Hillary down to the station if he was a Martian. So it's no surprise that, when all was said and done in the civil trial, a jury dismissed those claims on June 10th, 2022. Nick Hillary, no doubt tired of talking about the turmoil surrounding his various legal cases over more than a decade, declined through his attorney, Manai Tafari, to appear on this episode of the podcast. But Manai told me that he saw the civil trial itself as a victory. The police have given up on trying to solve this case, Manai said in a phone call. To us, it was a success to continue to put Nick's story out there and to show how he was treated through all of this. To show what can happen to a Black man when a law enforcement officer puts the target on him, Manai went on. Through all this, Nick's life has changed quite a bit. He's no longer coaching, for one. Now he's working alongside Manai for his Brooklyn-based law firm. And Nick has found notoriety and friends in the process. Much of Nick's criminal defenses and civil representation were funded through donations made to support him. But the civil court's decision left even more uncertainty in a case that seemed to have no end. Here's Natasha Haverty again.
I think that there might have been this expectation, if this were a movie, that this civil trial would be a referendum on everything that Nick Hillary had gone through, all the ways that law enforcement conducted themselves, from investigation to prosecution. But it's not a movie, and that's not what this was. Even the sort of equal protection claim, that Nick Hillary might have been treated differently because he was a Black man than white suspects who were at one point in the investigation. None of that even was part of this trial. Those didn't survive. So for better or for worse, the civil trial was really not a referendum on whether the police did everything right or wrong. It was on this very specific question, and it was very unpoetic.
It wasn't the worst of all possible circumstances, but it was close.
It didn't have that big sweeping end that maybe some people who have been following this case for years were looking for.
Nick has appealed the civil court's decision, so it's not exactly true that this ordeal in the wake of Garrett's death is complete. His attorneys are cautious, however, about their hope that he might eventually prevail. It could be a long shot. It's a long shot also about whether there's any clear accountability that the system provided and any real lessons to gain. Natasha offered some insight.
When we look at this in the broader context of holding police accountable, we know that that's a really hard thing to do. And having these conversations about people of color being mistreated by white officers or by police officers, and wanting the courtroom to be where we see that play out, that justice play out. This is just sort of another example of where it's not going to fit what some people wanted. So yeah, I'll be interested to see where this appeal goes, but it might show the limits of the law on both sides. Because meanwhile, back in St. Lawrence County, there's no indication that Mark Murray, who's now chief of police for Potsdam, or any of his colleagues are following any other leads or will ever find justice for Garrett.
If you're looking for more information about this case, including interviews with all the main players, as well as a visual of Nick being interviewed by Potsdam police in 2011, watch the gripping documentary Who Killed Garrett Phillips on HBO Max. It's one of the best court-based documentary thrillers I've watched recently. And follow Natasha Haverty's work through her website, natashahaverty.com. We'll put a link to the movie and Natasha's site in the show notes. There are also a ton of reporters who have covered this case in detail. We'll link to some of the best of their work, too. And feel free to get in touch about your thoughts on this case. Was Nick Hillary treated fairly? Did his civil case have merit? And how would you have approached this situation if you were someone close to Garrett? This is Matt Stroud, in for Jillian Jalali. She'll be back in your feed next week. We'll talk to you soon.
Hi, this is Jillian, and you might know me from Court Junkie, where I cover criminal cases and trials. Well, those of us here at Court Junkie have a new podcast called Civil, where we dive into fascinating civil cases. Many times, justice can't be served in a criminal court, but there's another option, civil court. Like in the case of a principal who took it upon himself to hypnotize students as a hobby. Then many of those students ended up dead. Or when a man was publicly and wrongfully accused of being the I-10 freeway shooter. He couldn't do anything in the criminal court to clear his name, so he filed a lawsuit. We'll also be covering popular civil cases you've likely heard of, like O.J. Simpson and Alex Jones versus the parents of Sandy Hook.
This is AC. I have OJ in the car.
Sandy Hook, it's got inside job written all over it.
There must be some basis for the person's assertion that there's a crime being committed.
Certainly, and I think the basis has been shown here. We hear the tip, right, albeit we don't know who it was that made the tip.
Let's listen in.
Thank everybody for coming out and showing your support. I told you guys when I first got arrested I didn't do it. I'm telling you now I'm going home I didn't do it. I'm going to go home now.
Hosted by me, Jillian Jalali, researched by Nicole Gusmarati, and written by Matt Stroud and Nick Kepler. If you like following criminal trials like I do, I think you will love Civil. Subscribe to us now on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.